The way of peace versus the way of the demagogue. In chapter 1, I contrasted the way of Jesus to the way of corrupt and brutish power, the way of Trump. No matter the issues that he may exploit to win our support, Christians must never embrace the way of Trump, even when, especially when, he makes such oddly condescending appeals as he made on July 26, 2024, at the Turning Point Believers Summit. In a long speech filled with lies and cruel attacks against his usual list of enemies, Trump said this.
And again, Christians, get out and vote just this time. You won't have to do it anymore. 4 more years, you know what? It'll be fixed. It'll be fine. You won't have to vote anymore, my beautiful Christians. I love you, Christians. I'm a Christian. I love you. Get out. You got to get out and vote. In 4 years, you don't have to vote again. We'll have it fixed so good you're not going to have to vote.
My skin crawls when I hear Trump's clumsy appeals to people of faith, people he clearly despises in real life. It's similar to how I feel when I watch him attempt to convey patriotism by groping the flag and burying his face in its folds. These sorts of strange and awkward appeals shouldn't work. They're humiliating to everyone involved, but millions of Christians do respond. I'm not sure why. Maybe we've simply lost touch with Jesus' love for us. Maybe the love of Jesus feels too distant or abstract, so the exploitative, manipulative love of Donald Trump, the serial abuser, feels like an upgrade. Whatever the attraction, it leads nowhere good for those who accept Trump's shtick. He brashly exploits the name of Jesus for his own gain. But to those with ears to hear, the way of Jesus quietly annihilates the way of Trump. The next 3 chapters dive deeper into Trump's abusive ways, into 3 disqualifying strategies that he uses to amass power and wealth for himself. Each of those strategies flows directly from his character, so we can't avoid looking at his moral deformities along the way. But these strategies have been around far longer than Donald Trump. He didn't invent them. They're the strategies that would-be authoritarians have long used to wrest power from the systems meant to hold them in check. Trump's character makes him the ideal candidate to employ the gross and twisted methods other strongmen have used to capture the support of believers. People of faith have played the role of willing enablers to some of the most corrupt rulers in the world. And every one of those leaders views the Christians who fall in line behind them as malleable buffoons, easily purchased with absurd cultural appeals. And aside from the depravity of it all, I find it puzzling that Christians aren't embarrassed by the whole performance. We prove those frauds right in their low opinion of us every time we vote for them. If basic decency doesn't lead us to reject people like Trump, I'd have expected that self-respect would, and maybe it will this time. In the following chapters, I'll delve into 3 of Trump's most common and most explicitly anti-Christian approaches to power and leadership. And I'll contrast them to the way Jesus requires his followers to act in this world. In light of Scripture, we'll see that Donald Trump has disqualified himself from receiving the votes of those who follow Jesus. So here's where this book is going. Chapter 2, this chapter, the way of peace versus the way of the demagogue. Chapter 3, the way of truth versus the way of the deceiver. Chapter 4, the way of justice versus the way of the oppressor. So what is a demagogue? This chapter explores the way of the demagogue, a word that I've used several times already. Merriam-Webster says, a demagogue is a political leader who tries to get support by making use of popular prejudices, as well as by making false claims and promises, and using arguments based on emotion rather than reason. Each part of that definition relates to our discussion of Trump. A demagogue is a political leader. So this is true so long as we realize that some political leaders never run for office. Like Charlie Kirk is a political demagogue who enriches himself as a Christian organizer and media personality. Greg Locke is a political demagogue who enriches himself as a quote-unquote pastor. Christian leadership lends itself to demagogues, unfortunately, and the Christian media complex has done far too little to expose people like this. Making use of popular prejudices. Pay attention to the words making use of in this definition. Demagogues make use of other people's prejudices. We needn't waste time proving or disproving Donald Trump's personal prejudices. They don't matter. He wants to exploit our prejudices with his rhetoric. It's an old tactic, and he's mastered it. First, he'll say something egregious, playing to the darkest nature of his audience. Then he'll wait for the inevitable outcry from his opponents so he can play the victim when they respond, as though they're crazily misinterpreting him. So he begins as a thug and ends as a victim. Rinse and repeat. It's a transparent game, but it works because his Christian followers play along. False claims and promises. I've listened to dozens of Trump's speeches, yet the lies and the distortions can still take my breath away. He piles one on top of the next, and he repeats them incessantly. It's a technique, an intentionally disorienting method meant to break down the defenses of his listeners and wear out his opposition. It's nothing new. Vladimir Putin, Viktor Orban, and any number of other demagogues do the same thing. Sadly, although anyone with online access could easily disprove his lies, millions of Christians cheer along at his rallies and endorse his strategy with our votes. Emotion rather than reason. Back in the before times, when I more strongly identified with the conservative movement, we prided ourselves on setting emotionalism aside in our politics. That self-description didn't quite measure up to reality even back then, but during the Trump years, it's become farcical. Emotions like grievance and disgust fuel Trump's MAGA machine. But then again, MAGA has never been conservative, not really. It's a populist movement, daydreaming about fascism. If I were writing this book from a conservative rather than pastoral perspective, I'd have more to say about that. Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger have covered some of that ground in their recent books, and I recommend them. So Donald Trump fits every definition of a demagogue, and in this chapter, I'll share examples of his demagogic behavior and contrast it with the way of Jesus. But you may be asking why I call this chapter the way of peace versus the way of the demagogue. How is peace the opposite of demagoguery? Peace poses a challenge to demagogues because demagogues thrive on chaos, on conflict, on fear. A world where everyone feels safe, where the rule of law is respected, where people can earn a living from their labors, where neighbors trust one another and work together to build their communities. When these basic conditions for life are in place, people won't listen to the appeals of a demagogue who's promising to break everything apart and put their enemies under his feet. It serves the interests of demagogues to stir up hatred and division. In the absence of peace, people will turn to a bully for protection. So wherever a nation feels friction, the demagogue fans it to a flame. Wherever a nation is divided, the demagogue widens the chasm. And if a nation catches a fleeting moment of peace, the demagogue starts throwing food, calling names, and making up stories. The way of peace. Christians aren't designed to follow the way of the demagogue. We're not made for this intentional stirring up of anger and strife and division. Followers of Jesus are called instead to practice the way of peace. Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God." If we want to understand where the way of the demagogue goes off the rails, we have to start with what we mean by the way of peace. I read a book years ago by Cornelius Plantinga called Not the Way It's Supposed to Be, a Breviary of Sin. In his first chapter, The Vandalism of Shalom, he paints a beautiful picture of what biblical peace looks like. He writes, "The webbing together of God, humans, and all creation in justice, fulfillment, and delight, is what the Hebrew prophets call shalom. We call it peace, but it means far more than mere peace of mind or a ceasefire between enemies. In the Bible, shalom means universal flourishing, wholeness, and delight, a rich state of affairs in which natural needs are satisfied and natural gifts fruitfully employed, a state of affairs that inspires joyful wonder as its creator and savior opens doors and welcomes in the creatures in whom he delights. Shalom, in other words, is the way things ought to be. Genesis 2 depicts the Garden of Eden, a delightful glimpse of shalom, of humans in right relationship with God and one another. All their needs are met. They have a purpose on the earth, and everything is as it should be. But when sin enters the world in Genesis 3, it ruptures our relationship with God, and the relationships between human beings become toxic and selfish. So God banishes humans from the garden, casting us out of that place of shalom. And that remains our sorry state to this day. We're created for shalom, for perfect harmony, for wholeness, for delight in God and one another. But we live in a world that's broken, painful, disappointing. We live in a world of scarcity and distrust where we struggle with one another for dominance and control. Our peace has been vandalized by sin. So the shalom that we long for, the shalom that God created us for, can seem impossible to achieve in this world. And sadly, many people give up on even trying to achieve that sort of peace in this lifetime. It seems like a fairy tale. So instead, they grab what they can for themselves out of this dark existence. And if we're not careful, even followers of Jesus can fall into cynicism. We may decide that we'll never experience shalom on this side of heaven, so until then, we'll fight for what's ours in this world, just like anyone else. But Jesus is not a cynic. Yes, he showed a healthy skepticism toward human beings when he walked the earth. The Gospel of John tells us he didn't entrust himself to human beings because he knew what was in us. But Jesus, who knew the full depths of our depravity, did not take a cynical view. Skepticism recognizes the fallen state of the world that we live in and the capacity for evil within each of us. But cynicism says that our capacity for evil is the last word about us. Cynicism tells us shalom is a fantasy, that we all care only for ourselves. Cynicism tells us to embrace the dark nature of this world, to scratch and claw for our own little piece of it. But Jesus rejected cynicism. Jesus came into this world that he created, knowing its fallen state, knowing how deep the vandalism of his creation had gone, so he might restore the shalom he'd always intended. That's what it means to practice the way of peace, the way of shalom. If we only look at peace as the absence of war or the absence of fighting, then on one level a strong man can keep the peace. But when we understand shalom, we know that it looks nothing like a fearful truce among people who hate each other, held in check through power and intimidation. When Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God," he didn't have in mind simply an absence of bloodshed. The passage below may help us understand better what Jesus means by peace. It's an ancient hymn about the Son of God from the Apostle Paul's letter to the Colossians. And in that hymn, Paul says that Jesus, the Son, was present at the creation of the universe. And he writes, "For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross." So here we find the beginnings of the Christian ministry of reconciliation. This passage assures us that the universe was made by the Son, it was made for the Son, and in him everything will be made right. He has made peace with God on our behalf, and he calls his people to extend that peace out to the world. In Jesus, one day, everything will be the way it ought to be. And that shalom, that state of universal flourishing where everything and everyone comes into right relationship to God and to one another, that's the peace that Jesus came to bring. Believers are called to share our hope for that kind of peace. When we follow the way of Jesus by the power of Jesus, we enjoy the privilege of sharing a glimpse of the kingdom of God in our midst, a foreshadowing of the peace that awaits us when the kingdom comes in its fullness. We don't reflect shalom, though, by fomenting hatred and division. In Romans 12, Paul shows us what the way of peace might look like on the ground in practical terms. He writes, "Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, 'It is mine to avenge. I will repay,' says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." We can't be on the side of Jesus and the bully. It's impossible to practice the way of peace by embracing the way of the demagogue. Why Trump can't be nice? Donald Trump tells us who he is every day, and he explains why he does what he does. It's not a secret, and it's not judgmental to point it out. Trump uses the name of Jesus, but rejects the way of Jesus, and he teaches his followers to do so too, as a political necessity. For instance, he said the following at a rally in Charlotte, North Carolina on July 23rd, 2024.
You know, I was supposed to be nice. They say something happened to me when I got shot. I became nice. And when you're dealing with these people, they're very dangerous people. When you're dealing with them, you can't be too nice. You really can't be. So if you don't mind, I'm not going to be nice. Is that okay?
So this is vintage Trumpian rhetoric. The other side poses such a grave threat that the normal rules of political engagement must be thrown aside. We must protect ourselves at all costs from the marauding hordes. From the same rally.
These are nasty people, the Democrats, so we better beat them or we're not going to have a country left. You're not going to have a country left. So now we have a new victim to defeat. Lion Kamala Harris, Lion, L-Y-I-N apostrophe. The most incompetent and far-left vice president in American history.
Well, at least Mike Pence can breathe a sigh of relief knowing that Trump has a new least favorite vice president. Trump skillfully orchestrates his rallies to cast himself as both thug and victim. He glories in his own inflammatory language, like referring to Kamala Harris as his next victim. Yet he rails against the rhetoric of his opponents and suggests that when people told the truth about his attacks on our system of government, it caused him to, quote, take a bullet for democracy. The attack on Trump's rally truly was a despicable attack on our civic life, but it doesn't appear to have been prompted by criticisms of Trump. It apparently wasn't even partisan. The shooter, a registered Republican, seems to have researched Biden rallies and other prominent political events before settling on the closest event to his home, which happened to be a Trump rally. At its core, the violent assault on Donald Trump and his audience fits the pattern of so many other antisocial attacks in recent years. A 20-year-old with an AR-15 attacked a political rally and a political candidate, just as people with AR-15s have assaulted so many other symbols of our culture: churches, schools, parades, concerts, not to mention the ordinary places we frequent every day, like grocery stores and restaurants. I made a video after the attack denouncing political violence and overheated rhetoric. Then I perused my own writing to see if I needed to tone down my criticisms, But I changed nothing in the end. I've been guided throughout my years of opposition to Trump by a deeply internalized desire to express a balance of grace and truth. I fail at times, but if each of us would try to emulate Jesus by balancing grace and truth in our political speech, we could transform the political discourse in this nation. That's why I find it unsettling that so many of the people at Trump's rallies identify as Christian. No major candidate in recent history spews such venom from the podium. He consistently uses demeaning and dehumanizing language about his opponents. Of course, every candidate uses sharp language to draw contrasts, but Trump's language drops well below the norms of political discourse. And beside Trump's own penchant for vulgar attacks, Stephen Miller, his main speechwriter, intentionally crafts language designed to stir up fear, loathing, and disgust. I'm certain Miller crafted the following quote, which Trump read at the same rally. It's designed to exploit his listeners' prejudice against immigrants in the most horrific terms possible. Immigration has always been a weapon of choice for demagogues. The quote disturbs me. I've spoken to crowds with children in attendance myself, so I find it hard to imagine what goes through Trump's mind when he repeats these sorts of stories on stage in front of children.
Earlier this year, a 15-year-old girl in Massachusetts was raped by a migrant who Biden and Harris flew into the United States against all orders. In upstate New York 2 months ago, another 15-year-old girl was attacked by an illegal alien that just walked into our country, assaulted with a metal pipe, abducted, driven to an isolated area, raped and killed.
He continues with more such stories, but that's enough. These accounts are horrifying, and he repeats them often. Trump boasted months ago that he invented the phrase migrant crime, and he promised to use it as an issue in the campaign. He knows that sort of rhetoric works. Although numerous studies show that migrants do not commit more crimes than native-born Americans, these graphic accounts overwhelm our intellect. They're aimed straight at our brainstem. Trump wants his audience to say, "Who cares about a study? This is horrific." As long as migrants come to the United States, we'll hear stories about migrant crime. As long as Baptists live here, we'll hear stories about heinous acts committed by people who happen to be Baptists. We just won't call that phenomenon Baptist crime. The same goes for truck drivers, accountants, vegetarians, cowboys. We can find examples of violent crimes committed by any group of people. Donald Trump knows this, of course, but the truth has never stopped him from telling a gripping story. He knows we'll respond when he tickles our prejudices. So he accuses immigrants of, quote, poisoning the blood of our country. He got exactly the reaction he wanted when he used that phrase the first time. People were shocked, and they alerted him, as though he didn't already know, that this phrase echoes the words of Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf. So he used it again. It's his favorite game. Say something obviously wicked, enjoy basking in the transgressive camaraderie of the crowd, then play the victim when, quote, crazy people, quote, overreact by pointing out that Hitler said the same thing. It's a great gig for a morally stunted 78-year-old vulgarian who thrives on attention, if you can get it. And he'll keep that gig for as long as his base, his mostly Christian base, plays along. In short, Donald Trump can't be nice because his political strategy depends upon stoking hatred and division. As a church planter, I learned a principle that applies to every movement. How you attract people is how you'll keep them. If you attract them with emotion, you'll have to keep giving them more of it. If it's a sound and light show instead of a worship service, someday you'll be buying lasers and a fog machine. In Trump's case, he's built his movement around stoking emotions like fear and grievance and envy. And if he stops ramping up the supply, he's afraid his users will wander off elsewhere for their fix. A word about hate in politics. I call Trump's political events hate rallies because he designs them specifically to stir up hatred and disgust and fear in his audience. I'm not accusing Trump's followers of hatred, though, but I'm warning everyone who listens to him, whether we support him or oppose him, that stirring up our hatred is his goal. Whether we choose to go along or not, he's trying to incite his listeners to hatred as a political strategy. Now, I struggle to properly address Trump's strategic use of hatred because the conversation quickly takes on a both sides dynamic. So yes, extremists of every type have long fomented hatred in their followers, and we must resist all those appeals. But Trump has taken that strategy mainstream in a way that no other presidential candidate has attempted, at least in my lifetime. So because of my efforts against the MAGA movement, people often accuse me of hating Trump myself. And this may be their own projection, but it's worth talking about. We can all do better at confronting bullies without falling over the edge into hatred. So toward that end, I'll describe my own struggle as transparently as I can. I do oppose Trump's tactics. I do find his demagogic rhetoric to be dangerous in a man who seeks the presidency. And if I wanted to appear more spiritual than I am, I could just end my comments at that point. But it wouldn't be authentic because on a personal level, I am repelled by the things that he reveals about his character every day. So the following statements are not unfair judgments about Trump. They're based on observable, established facts. Christians make a mockery of our discernment when we deny these things, or when we accuse people of judgmentalism for calling attention to these realities. So Donald Trump uses abusive, bullying speech every day. He sexually degrades women with his words. He's been proven in court to have sexually abused at least one woman, and he's been credibly accused by many more. He's been proven in multiple courts to have committed serial acts of fraud. In his selfish pursuit of power and wealth, he's brought division to our nation and immense suffering to individuals. He orchestrated a months-long campaign of inflammatory lies about the 2020 election that led to an assault on the Capitol, an assault in which people died. He continues to spread those same lies, and he's preemptively begun to lie about the upcoming election. And in all these things, he blasphemes the name of Jesus by claiming to speak for Jesus' followers. Now, I'll put this next one in its own paragraph, since this one is a personal opinion. I find Trump's combination of breathtaking ignorance and entirely unmerited self-regard profoundly objectionable. In short, I wouldn't walk across the street to have a Diet Coke with Donald Trump. And I'm disappointed by people who accept his unrepentant return to society and politics as somehow legitimate. I'm disillusioned by the widespread acceptance by Christians of so many things that we found utterly unacceptable just a few years ago. But if Trump were thirsty, I'd give him water. If he were hungry, I'd give him food. I don't hate Donald Trump. I have no desire to see him suffer. I want him to quit manipulating people of faith and quit abusing our nation in Jesus' name. I want to see his heretical movement defeated, rejected by voters, and repudiated by history. And when it comes to his criminality, I want our justice system to deal with him fairly and impartially in the coming years. He deserves the same rights and privileges as any citizen before the law. My introduction to politics came through my work in the pro-life movement long before I entered pastoral ministry. And I hold a core belief about human life. Every one of us bears the image of God. I dare not hate the image of God in any human being. So even as I do this critical work of warning Christians about him, and even though I personally dislike what he's revealed to us about his character, I honor the image of God in Donald Trump. Christians don't belong at hate rallies. And just as I don't appreciate being accused of hatred myself, I don't want to unfairly accuse Trump supporters of hatred. I'm quite critical of the choice Christians make to participate in Trump's rallies, but I don't believe they themselves are primarily motivated by hate. I assume their motivations run the gamut, from enjoying a good time with like-minded friends to genuinely wanting to support a movement that they believe will take our country in a better direction. I've been thinking about this a lot since the brutal attack on Trump and his audience in Pennsylvania. I grieve for the people at that rally who were killed or wounded. I don't know them, but when I heard about them, I remembered my own experience at a Trump rally in Minneapolis in October of 2019. I spent several hours that day with people who could have been my neighbors, my family members, part of my church. And even though I disagreed with them, I didn't dislike them. Until that day in 2019, I hadn't spoken publicly about Trump. Since retiring from ministry in 2016, I'd only shared my concerns privately with friends and family, but Trump's aggressive appeals to Christians, combined with the very public backing that he received from prominent Christian leaders, eventually pushed me over the edge. I decided that Trump's visit to Minneapolis would be my coming out party as a vocal opponent of the Trumpian heresy. I assumed people from my church might be at the rally, so I put on one of my favorite hats and a black shirt. It's this black shirt here that I used to always wear for preaching because I wanted them to recognize me. I wanted them to recognize me when I loudly voiced my opposition inside the arena. As their former pastor, I wanted them to know that I disagreed with Trump's appeals to their worst nature. But other than that, I had no specific plan. I get nervous around people, believe it or not, which was always a bit of a liability as a pastor. And I especially don't like drawing negative attention to myself. Hard to believe with this YouTube channel, but I don't like drawing negative attention to myself. So I decided just not to think about it until I got inside the stadium. I know Trump seems dissipated now, a late career Elvis, but he was a big deal in 2019. The 45th president of the United States of America. So people wanted to see him. So I showed up early, but it turned out I wasn't nearly early enough. The line of rally goers behind the Target Center already wrapped back and forth and in upon itself intestinally, then back out and several blocks down the street. And I knew I was just never going to get inside. So instead, I chose to perform an object lesson for the people in line. I gathered my courage, and I took a couple of deep, calming breaths. Then I cut in line in the most obvious and non-subtle fashion that I could. I just brazenly skipped ahead of a few thousand people. And the folks behind me, who you'll remember had come to celebrate Donald Trump, somehow found my action morally offensive, ethically repugnant, and quite possibly sinful. They murmured among themselves about what to do with me. So soon they appointed a spokesperson. I heard his voice behind me. "Can we help you?" And I waited for him to ask a couple more times, a bit louder with each repetition. And then I turned to face him and his friends, and I feigned surprise. "Oh, me?" Now this might all sound kind of strange if you're not from Minnesota, but around here we call this doing conflict. So he looked like every guy I've ever played softball with on a church league. He looked like every guy I've ever rocked out with at a music festival or stood beside in the Pronto Pup line at the Minnesota State Fair. Not a monster, not a hater, just a good dude. I learned later that he and his friends and family came to the rally because they'd never seen a president of the United States in the flesh before. He wore a t-shirt from a rural Minnesota fire department. I thought about him recently when I learned that the man who lost his life in the Trump rally shooting in Pennsylvania had also been a firefighter. I admire and respect anyone who serves in that kind of a profession. I understood why the crowd chose this guy to confront me. I would have chosen him too. He said, "Sir, you just cut in line." "Oh," I replied. "Yes, you just cut in line in front of thousands of people." He seemed a little exasperated that my transgression was less obvious to me than it was to him. "Oh, that," I smiled as innocently as I could. "That's no problem. I learned from my president that the rules don't apply anymore. Cutting in line isn't against the law. It's just a norm. I'm not breaking a law. I'm only breaking a norm." The people stared at me, and I smiled and blinked for a while. And they discussed what I'd said and begrudgingly acknowledged that I'd made a solid point, so they let me stay. And then after the initial tension wore off, I got to know a bit about these folks. They weren't especially political, and if I'd wanted to, I could have debated some of the finer points of their support for Trump, but mostly I listened while they talked to each other. It felt exactly like one of my family reunions, except I showed more restraint than I typically do with my own family. But once inside the arena, I made my way directly behind the stage, but in the upper deck, above the view of the cameras. And I sat and watched the preliminary propaganda, including some disturbingly bigoted attacks against my fellow Minnesotan, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. I studied the people around me. For the most part, they seemed bored and low energy, but we'd all been standing in the sun for hours to get in. I think the true believers must have been down on the main floor because the folks with me up in the nosebleed section mostly were just waiting silently through the warm-up acts. And Mike Pence spoke before Trump. It was somewhat unusual to have Trump and Pence at the same rally, but they thought that they had a shot at winning Minnesota in 2020, so they went all in. Pence's speech bothered me far more than anything else I heard that day because he so willingly leveraged his position as a public Christian to sell the crowd on Donald Trump in the name of Jesus. As he spoke, I kept thinking about the conservative columnist George Will. George is right, I thought to myself. Oleaginous. The word is oleaginous. For the record, I'm glad that Mike Pence did the right thing on January 6th, 2021, and I'm glad that he's refusing to endorse Trump this time around. It's a decent start, but his approval rating remains underwater with me. His speech that night was one of many endorsements he gave Trump over the years. And I've yet to hear him admit that for 4 years, in service to his own ambition, he knowingly slathered Donald Trump with a thick Jesus sheen. As the most prominent follower of Christ in the Trump administration, Mike Pence did far more damage to the Christian conscience than Trump ever could. And by the time the Lee Greenwood song started playing and Trump took the stage, I felt more than ready to say my piece and leave. And I didn't want to do it, but I knew that this act was far more important for me myself than for anyone who might hear me. As futile as it may seem, it felt almost sacramental, almost like a baptism into my public opposition to Trump. I knew Trump was dangerous. I knew he was leading followers of Jesus over a spiritual cliff. I knew that the hateful words being spoken at that rally directly repudiated the way of Jesus. And more than anything, I knew that Christians didn't belong in that arena. So I stood and I walked down the concrete steps way up among the rows of crowded seats, down to the upper deck railing, directly behind the president. I turned and looked back at the crowd above me, who were starting to notice me. And then I scanned for the nearest security guard. I made eye contact with him and nodded to give him the heads up. I wanted him to get to me before the crowd. Then I took another calming breath and climbed over the railing and out onto a small platform above the crowd. The security guard motioned for me to get back, and I just gave him a friendly wave, and then he started towards me. So I waited a beat for Trump's next pause. Then I cupped my hands to my mouth, and I yelled some rather dumb stuff like, "You're a liar, you're a criminal." It was neither the time nor the place for a nuanced discussion. And as the words left my mouth, they just disappeared into that cavernous hall. Like in the video of Trump's speech that day, I can recognize the moment because I hear my voice just faint, quite faint, and I see the people directly behind Trump crane their necks to watch the disturbance. But to me, it felt like a bad dream where I'm trying to desperately get someone's attention, but my words come out muffled and garbled and incoherent. So when the security guard came to fetch me, I went along willingly, but I did turn to face the crowd above me, hundreds of whom were shouting their displeasure and booing my performance. I didn't feel bad for them. I knew that I'd given them the most truth and probably the most excitement that they'd experienced that day. So I smiled broadly and I threw my arms out in an "Are you not entertained?" gesture. And then I followed security down to the bowels of the Target Center to talk to the police. I wanted so badly to get arrested, but since I really hadn't done anything more than speak out of turn, they simply wrote down my information and took my photo. Then they warned me that from here on out, I'm forever banned from Trump rallies. The sheriff's deputy who drove me out of the security perimeter on a golf cart asked me what I'd done. I said, I told the truth to the President of the United States, but in a rather unkind manner. He smiled and said, at his own party? As I stepped through the final gate, I turned back to him and asked, wait, am I kicked out of all the Targets or just the Target Center? What? Have you seen O Brother, Where Art Thou? No, I haven't. Oh, okay, never mind. You should watch it, then you'll agree I just said something really funny. I tell that story partly because this book could use some levity, but mostly I tell it because I believe with all my heart that the majority of Trump's supporters are better than Trump, and they're better than a Trump rally. They don't belong in that environment. It's intentionally designed to appeal to their worst nature. For myself, I decided from then on to quit screaming into the void. Instead, I would devote myself to making a coherent case against Donald Trump to any believers who are willing to listen. This book is just one more step in the direction I chose that night. Trump's Demagoguery on Abortion, a case study. Just to level set, let's begin with a basic fact that's gone underreported. Donald Trump is running in 2024 as the most pro-choice Republican presidential candidate in decades. He's shown little evidence over the years of having a personal stake in the abortion issue, and now he's reverting to form because the political winds have shifted. His abortion strategy for this election boils down to winking at moderate voters that he's returned to his pro-choice roots while employing demagogic language around late-term abortions to keep the pro-life voters in the camp. So in two destructive ways, Trump has acted as a cultural arsonist regarding the right to life. First, his false, cruel, and callous rhetoric about such a personal issue has only deepened the emotional chasm between the opposing sides. And second, his utter failure to grasp and articulate the core moral and ethical arguments on either side has damaged our ability to reason with one another about a problem of great moral complexity. It's always and only about politics with Trump. It's about posturing and positioning. He's trying to have it both ways. Having awoken the pro-choice movement through his Supreme Court nominations and his boasts about overturning Roe v. Wade, he found it politically expedient for many months afterwards to suggest a compromise version of a national ban. He doesn't understand the issue, so he failed to grasp how fully his compromise proposals undercut the core arguments of both sides. So having lit the fire and fanned the flames, he's now running away from the issue and, quote, leaving it to the states. If he were the sort of pro-life Republican that I used to vote for, I'd say that leaving it to the states could almost be a defensible position. When I helped mobilize around this issue decades ago, my main political goal was to get Supreme Court justices nominated who would eventually overturn Roe. We weren't talking about national bans back then, Perhaps I was misled, and it's clear I'm rethinking many of my past positions, but I strongly believed at the time that Roe was a bad opinion and that it wrongly took power from the states. But the conversation has moved beyond the states. Both sides have now mobilized for battle over a national solution. And neither side believes Trump when he says he's not going to sign a national abortion ban. His track record suggests that he'll do whatever serves his political interests when that moment arrives. So he's de-emphasizing abortion on the one hand, yet he continues his vile rhetoric when he speaks to pro-lifers at rallies. And Trump's divisive political speech, combined with his lack of moral clarity, has led the nation inexorably toward an all-out political fight, a destructive conflict over a sensitive issue that we will not solve through political warfare. And I no longer want any part of that fight. I worked in the pro-life movement for years, and until 2018, I refused to vote for a pro-choice candidate under any circumstances. I still care deeply about lifting the value of human life in our culture, but the Trump years changed me. In many ways, they broke me, and I'm still reassembling myself. His presidency taught me the ultimate futility of trying to address the issue through power politics. Trump has emitted such a noxious cloud around the pro-life message that in the minds of many Americans, the, quote, sanctity of human life sounds like just another weapon in his arsenal, devoid of moral substance, designed only to punish the enemies of MAGA. But while my views on abortion politics have changed, I'd like to make a point that many of my pro-choice friends don't take seriously enough. For most of us who call ourselves pro-life, our motivation really has been always as simple as seeing the unborn child as a human being and trying to figure out what to do about that. I understand that seeing the unborn child as a human being can lead to complex discussions around fetal personhood, which impacts decisions regarding issues like in vitro fertilization or certain forms of birth control. That's one reason I started moving off of my hardline approach many years ago. But I can't completely reconfigure my basic wiring on this issue. I was 7 years old in 1973 when Roe v. Wade came into effect, and I was about 8 years old the first time I heard about it in 1974. I saw a political ad about abortion at my grandparents' house, so I asked my mom what it meant. And she told me, and I decided from then on that I was on the baby's side. But once I was old enough to think more deeply about it, I never considered it to be such a simple case. I felt that it came down to balancing the rights of a woman against the rights of an unborn child, and I've always found that troubling. On most issues, I default heavily to the side of liberty. I'm geared toward increasing freedom of conscience, not limiting it. As I continued to work out my position over the years, I began to recognize God as the one who holds all the rights in the universe. So I increasingly grounded my understanding of human rights in the biblical teaching that each of us is created in the image of God. So when I spoke with secular folks, I might start with the Declaration of Independence and argue that according to our founders, we're each endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, such as the right to life. And when I spoke to Christians, I'd begin with Genesis 1 and argue that our rights spring directly from our role as God's image bearers on the earth. In each case, though, I taught, and I still believe, that the greatest protection for human beings against exploitation and abuse is to recognize, along with the Declaration of Independence and Genesis 1, that our basic human rights come from somewhere far beyond the reach of mere earthly rulers. Whether that creator is the God of the Bible or an abstract idea that we recognize as part of our shared civic religion, the message is the same. Human beings have intrinsic value, rights, and dignity simply by virtue of being human. And these rights transcend politics. They matter. And balancing those rights against competing rights requires wisdom and grace. So none of this is easy. Even at the height of my political involvement, I never took it lightly that my pro-life position impinged on the bodily autonomy rights of an entire group of people, a group that I didn't belong to. But I couldn't shake my conviction that the unborn child's right to life outweighed the other considerations. So I felt constrained by my conscience to vote for candidates who opposed abortion. I still believe the unborn child is a human being. I don't know how I could see it any other way. But I no longer believe in the wisdom of my old political approach to upholding the sanctity of life. On purely pragmatic grounds, the anti-abortion movement has lost the public argument for at least the next generation. Yet radically anti-Christian candidates like Donald Trump still exploit pro-life Christian voters to get themselves elected. But even if our politics were more favorable to abortion bans, I've changed my mind about the prudence and effectiveness of overly strict measures. By listening to the pro-choice arguments, I've learned more about the negative impact strict abortion laws can have on women's health care, for instance. The legal and medical issues are complex. I've had to adopt a posture of greater humility as I rethink how my basic belief in the sanctity of life, which I still hold, ought to impact my political choices. And I don't have the answers. Once this election is over, I look forward to having the time to develop a more helpful approach to fostering a culture of life in our nation. For example, I listened to a Holy Post podcast a while back, an interview with Angela Wesley from the organization Pro Grace. I was intrigued, and I planned to look more deeply into that organization. On their website, they identify themselves like this: "We are a community advancing a non-political approach to abortion that rises above the divide by demonstrating God's grace and value for all people." That seems like a good place to start. But Trump's rhetoric and the amoral political lens that he applies to the issue has made it more difficult for people to have the sorts of conversations that we ought to have. And by throwing in with a man as odious and transactional as Trump, pro-lifers have sacrificed whatever goodwill they may have built up in the culture. Trump has made it harder to simply talk non-politically about how we can elevate respect for human life at every stage. As someone who spent years speaking about the sanctity of life, I'm appalled by the way Trump exploits the issue. Here he is in the National Religious Broadcaster speech that I mentioned in an earlier chapter.
They're willing to kill the unborn in the 6th and 7th and 8th and 9th months, and even after birth. I mean, even after birth. You remember the governor, that former governor of Virginia, that said the baby will be born and we will decide to kill the baby after birth. We will make a decision with the mother. This is the first time I heard that, but there is legislation in some states where you actually have the right to do that. So they're the radicals.
In no state is it legal to kill the baby after birth. That's called murder everywhere in America. But Trump repeats this lie again and again because he knows that it packs a powerful emotional punch. And he knows that Americans broadly oppose abortion in the later months of pregnancy, after fetal viability. So he feels safe on that rhetorical ground. But the first time I heard Trump talk about late-term abortions, as he calls them, to a rally audience, I felt deeply troubled. I felt troubled by the obvious delight that he took in holding the crowd mesmerized with phrases like, quote, ripping the baby from its mother's womb. When I spoke on pro-life issues years ago, I found talking about the procedure itself quite difficult and sobering. But Trump seems energized by the language, by the vividness of the descriptions, by the power the imagery gives him over his audience. As I've mentioned, the dirty secret is that Trump focuses on abortions later in pregnancy because before he completely gave up and punted the issue to the states, he'd been pushing for a national compromise. And when he floated trial balloon suggestions for a national abortion ban, he talked about setting the allowed gestational age for abortions at either 15 or 16 weeks. This comment was typical. The number of weeks now people are agreeing on 15, and I'm thinking in terms of that. It'll come out to something that's very reasonable. But people are really, even hardliners are agreeing, seems to be 15 weeks, seems to be a number that people are agreeing at. Whether he realizes it or not, this position, which he falsely claims even hardliners agree to, is not very different from life under Roe v. Wade. Roe already allowed for government regulation of abortion after the point of fetal viability, which people often place between 20 and 24 weeks. It's been a while since I worked in the pro-life movement, but we used to have a phrase to describe the type of position Trump advocates. We called it pro-choice. Many Christians have called me a baby killer because I oppose Donald Trump. If they continue to embrace him this year, now that he's adopted a pro-choice stance, I'll just have to ask, was your support for Trump ever really about the babies? Donald Trump's national ban compromise would have only affected abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy. And according to the Centers for Disease Control, over 96% of abortions occur before the end of the 15th week. So under the various compromises he suggested, over 96% of all abortions would be untouched by his proposed national ban. And a number of the 4% of abortions that might be banned under his compromise would fall under various exceptions, since they sometimes involve heartbreaking health circumstances. So this is where the demagoguery comes into play. Trump's proposed compromise would affect only a small fraction of abortions, smaller than 4%, since many states already have laws against these procedures. So since he's in favor of choice, for all but a tiny fraction of abortions, he uses extreme language to assure his followers that he's really, really opposed to that tiny fraction. According to his rhetoric, that fractional difference between his own position and his opponent's position makes him a righteous defender of life, and his opponent some of the most radically evil human beings on the planet. Mike Pence spoke out forcefully against Trump's abortion stance on July 9th of this year. The Republican National Committee adopted new wording for the party platform to reflect Trump's retreat from abortion as an issue in the upcoming election. Pence said the new platform, quote, removed historic pro-life principles that have long been the foundation of the platform, unquote. According to CNN, Pence called on delegates attending the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, quote, to restore language to our party's platform, recognizing the sanctity of human life and affirming that the unborn child has a fundamental right to life which cannot be infringed, unquote. A vote for Donald Trump will mean less than nothing for the pro-life movement in 2024. It will ratify Trump's current position that abortion ought to be left completely to the states, and it will generally affirm his pro-choice understanding of where the lines ought to be drawn. So having appointed the justices who overturned Roe, he wants nothing more to do with the issue. He wants pro-life voters to support him in gratitude for what he did in the past, and he wants pro-choice voters to support him because they need not fear what he'll do in the future. Trump doesn't understand a person like Mike Pence, who seems to sincerely believe what he says about abortion. Pence has no choice but to oppose Trump's reasoning. It obliterates the very heart of the pro-life argument that life begins at conception. By so callously throwing out a certain number of weeks as though he's negotiating on the completion date for a new swimming pool at Mar-a-Lago, Trump thoroughly undermines the essence of the pro-life argument. As I've said, I came to see in the wake of the 2016 election that abortion politics has poisoned our nation against itself. I voted third party in 2016 rather than for Hillary Clinton, the pro-choice candidate. But by 2018 midterms, I saw how things worked, and I wish I had seen it sooner. Donald Trump and the GOP hacked the system somewhere along the way. They thought, with good reason, that people like me would never vote for a pro-choice candidate, so they took our votes for granted. They locked us tightly into their fold with this one issue. That meant they could expand their messaging out to an entirely new group of voters, and that new group of voters responded to a different kind of rhetoric, a kind that people like me find revolting and destructive, the rhetoric of anger and grievance and cultural paranoia. Donald Trump shows us every day by his demagogic language toward entire groups of people that his claim to be pro-life means nothing. It's a crass political attempt to purchase the votes of millions of people who, by any moral or ethical standard, ought to have rejected him long ago. Trump's language around abortion has nothing to do with the sanctity of life or an understanding of the image of God in every human being. He tramples on the image of God in his enemies every day. Christian support for Donald Trump under the guise of pro-life issues will be remembered in the years to come as a loathsome chapter in the history of the church.